All right, time for a little football at 4. A lot of NFL stuff to dive into as we were talking the last hour or so. We talked to Andy Reid in hour 1. We got into some quarterback stuff in hour 2. Johnny Mac got the football at 4. It's brought to you by Matt Blatt Kia. They want to get you approved today. Matt Blatt Kia, 6211 Black Horse Pike in EHT. Mike Bosch, Ryan, till 6 tonight. And, of course, Super Bowl 54. Your station exclusively in South Jersey. Coverage starts at 5 o'clock on Super Sunday. Johnny Mac on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Going to talk some NFL with us. And a new movement, by the way, in the Eagles' offensive coaching search. But it seems like they've made some movement on the defensive side of the ball. Nothing official yet, guys, but it looks like it's trending that way. And some interesting names emerging on the defense. A couple of coordinators in the past going to be part of this staff, it looks like. John, what do we know?
Well, Matt Burke, we knew, as we talked about a lot, that's a very good friend of Jim Schwartz. He was brought on last year as a special assistant, former defensive coordinator with the Dolphins. And it's one of those things where, because of the timing, probably weren't able to put together the staff quite like you want to. And then there's always the thought process of somebody like that, if they're going to get another coordinator job somewhere, they want to leave that avenue open. And then you talk about Jim interviewing with the Cleveland Browns. If he had gotten that job, Matt Burke probably goes with him. So a lot of moving parts to that, but ultimately if Jim was going to be back, Matt was going to be a part of the staff if he wasn't a coordinator. So that one is what we all expected. It was just which position would it be, secondary coach, defensive line coach. And as I said, you listen to Jim talk about his defense, the engine of his defense, always talks about the defensive line. He thinks that's the most important part of the defense. He's probably right. So it makes sense that he's going to put the guy he's most comfortable with in that position. And then the defensive backs coach, if Marquand Manuel gets the job, as everyone expects, to cover 3 guys, Seattle, Atlanta, single high. It's what Jim likes to do. He does quite a bit different, does a little bit more than a typical Seattle-Atlanta defense, but when have a lot of experience playing single high, that's kind of the default setting. So I think that makes a lot of sense as well.
Yeah, something you tweeted earlier today, John, I thought really resonated because, I had the same thought too, is that if you bring in Marquand Manuel, who's been a defensive coordinator, and Matt Burke, who was a defensive coordinator down in Miami, now in charge of the D-line, you have a staff that has a veteran presence to it. You have guys in the classrooms and in the playbook design room on the night before the game who have all been, along with Jim Schwartz, that's 3 defensive coordinators. And I think Ken Flajole, if I'm not mistaken, was a defensive coordinator at one point. So that's if nothing else, it's a room full of very experienced defensive minds.
Yeah, more high profile, I think, and obviously when you've been in a defensive coordinator position in the NFL, it carries with some weight, and you're known, and people recognize the name. So at least on paper, it looks like a much stronger staff. You look at Corey Unlin, who is now a defensive coordinator in Detroit, ironically, but had not been until this year. But he's got a lot more experience as a coach than Marquand Manuel, who was a player for 7-8 years in this league, and then went into coaching and has been on a fast track in that system for Seattle. Then when Dan Quinn left for Atlanta. So you can look at it both ways. Corey's actually been a coach longer, but Manuel's been a defensive coordinator. So there's a little cachet there that wasn't there before if the Eagles hire him as expected.
Yeah, and it gives, I guess, on the surface, when you hear that, it gives the Eagles much more experience on that defensive side of the ball in terms of the coaching staff. Yeah,
well, Matt does. Like I said, in theory, Corey has more experience than Marquand as a coach. And again, we talked about that a little bit yesterday. If you thought about Josh McCown for some reason, and I'll say it again, that 7-8 years playing in the league is experience as well. But he's a young guy for a coach, and he's been, as I said, on the fast track, and he's already been a coordinator. So that in a very good system, that is a proven system. I mean, that Seattle team under Pete Carroll, Legion of Boom, that's the best defense of this generation. Then you go with Dan Quinn to Atlanta. So it's some pretty impressive names that he's been able to catch the eye of. So I think that's the most positive part of it.
Yeah, and Burke, you mentioned, and Marquez, was he on that Falcons Super Bowl staff? He was the coordinator right after that, right?
Yeah, it was a coordinator, but he went with Dan Quinn. So he was the coordinator in 2017, 2018. But he was with Dan in Seattle, and then he was one of the coaches that he took to Atlanta with him.
Hey, John, if Andrew Berry leaves for the Cleveland GM job, which now seems very likely because George Patton has taken himself out of the running, do you see I think there are still some coaching staff openings for the Browns under Kevin Stefanski, and maybe some personnel ones will take shape too if he's running the department. Is there anyone that comes up in your head as maybe an Eagle fan should be worried that Andrew Berry takes this guy with him? I know we know he's only been here for a little bit, but
yeah, that's. I wouldn't be that concerned because of that reason. He's only been here since February, so we're not even a year, and it's unlikely that Andrew will last a year here. So I'm not sure how many relationships he's developed. You talk about the Browns and Kevin Stefanski. Well, one of the reasons George Payton took the interviews, that's one of those guys, sort of like a mini Eric DaCosta, always turns down interviews. He took them because he liked working with Kevin Stefanski for 13 years. But that's 13 years. I mean, Andrew's only been here for less than a calendar year. And then the second part, the Eagles already had their front office set up and sort of added Andrew to a new position. So the guys were already in place, the Andy Waddles on personnel, Jake Rosenberg contracts, Alec Halaby analytics. So all those guys are in place. I wouldn't be concerned about losing others. You never know. There might be a lower level personnel guy. But I don't think it would be a big name or anything of that nature.
Now, real quick, the report out there is that Ben McAdoo was seen at the Browns facility today. Now, there was some talk that they might go without a offensive coordinator, as you talked about yesterday, that if they can't find the right guy, they're just not going to do one. You're wondering if the Eagles are sliding down that road.
I bet Odell Beckham was really happy to see that, too.
True.
Yeah, well, I think Odell's going to get shipped out of there pretty quickly as well, so I'm not sure it's going to matter. But with Stefanski, he said, and you always have to take these things with a grain of salt, that if he finds the right guy, he'll hire an offensive coordinator. He's even said he might let that offensive coordinator call plays if he finds the right guy. So any offensive, you look at the way this league is trending, he would be the first offensive head coach in a long time that comes into a new situation and doesn't call plays. That's just the way you do it now. I think it would be a breath of fresh air. I think it's smart to be a CEO type coach, but nobody does it. And that tends, if it does happen, it tends to develop 4, 5, 6 years down the line when you feel more comfortable. So we talk about titles all the time, and I think that's what it is. Is it really that? Does it really matter anyway? Obviously, Ben McAdoo wants to get back into the NFL. It's been a while for him. You want to get in from his perspective at a coordinator position. In theory, this could be a nice spot for him, but I think Kevin Stefanski's going to call plays. I'll say that.
Yeah, probably, and that's the thing, where obviously on the offensive side of the ball, it's harder to find guys. But what did Adam say at it was Garofolo on Wednesday's show was saying he had people coming up to him almost trying to get Mike to ask the Eagles to get these guys interviews with the team, because they find it to be a job that they're interested in, whether it be the wide receiver coach, the defensive backs coach. So guys who are trying to get their foot in the door, maybe not as the coordinator because maybe they know they're not ready for that level of job, but this is an attractive place to coach because they feel that success is going to potentially be here.
Yeah, I mean, that part of it has always been overblown. There's always going to be coaches that want to come to a situation. There are only 32 of these jobs, whether it's coordinator jobs, position coaches. It's not easy to get one of these jobs. So when we talk about not getting who you want, that doesn't mean there's not going to be multiple options. I mean, the Eagles and the Browns are the only two teams that don't have offensive coordinators now. So at this point, there's no real need to hurry because they're not looking at the same people. You can take your time, and there's plenty of people on the street, so to speak, that would raise your eyebrows and say, "Oh, that's a big name." Ben McAdoo's a perfect example. I mean, that's a former head coach of this league that was almost the head coach of this organization and this team. That's how things move so quickly and change so quickly. And there's always names. And so those people say nobody wants the job because Doug Peterson calls plays. I mean, that's just silly. That's just not true, that part of it.
I wonder how long before Freddie Kitchens' name comes up, because we haven't seen that. But you're right. It's the way it's going. It's likely to be someone who doesn't have a job now because these teams, they want to know who they're going to be moving ahead with as they prepare for their offseason.
That's an interesting name that hasn't been brought up in any circle. He was a coordinator that had some respect,
I think
got a head coaching job, and then it's funny how fast your name is tarnished.
I think I saw something with the Giants maybe because he has a relationship with Joe Judge from Alabama.
I heard perhaps Lombardo on Mays and Eitan mention him the other day.
But it seems like
that's and he might be the kind of guy that's got to take a step back. That's sort of what happens in this league.
Right.
When things go bad, sometimes you have to take a step back, stay out of the league for a year. And that's why you see guys going to practices. We mentioned Mike McCoy before, going to training camp practices, and that's kind of what you do. Mike McCarthy, when he was out, sort of took the time off and reevaluated what he did and tried to cultivate relationships so when he got a job, he'd be ready to jump right back in as far as assistants go and things like that. So that's sometimes what you have to do. But there's always a lot of really smart people because there are more smart people in this league than there are coaching positions when it comes to coordinators and even head coaches. So there's always going to be names that will pique your interest available, even if you end up being the last team to have a coordinator, which certainly might be the road we're going down with the Eagles.
What do you know about George Edwards, who was hired by the Cowboys? Now, no title for him, but he was the coordinator in Minnesota. Yeah,
he was the coordinator the entire time Mike Zimmer has been there. So 6 years, his contract expired. And Zimmer's at that point, we always talk about coaches and having shelf lives, and he sort of did that with his defensive back coach as well, Jerry Gray, who I thought maybe would pique the Eagles' interest at some point because he's a really high-profile coach that has had a lot of success, but they didn't go down that road. But from all the indications, it was they think they needed a voice change. And that's what happens in coaches. If you're in one position for a really long time, people stop listening. It's kind of what happened to Andy Reid here as a head coach. So when you are a head coach who's been in a position for a long time, and Zimmer has now, you got to make those changes. You got to keep things fresh, and so they let certain contracts expire, and they let guys go to other positions.
Well, that's like the natural progression of when you're in trouble. It's like you're in trouble,
Yeah,
you're not
exactly.
fired, but you got to get rid of somebody else. Otherwise, it's going to be you. So, like, normally, like, and I guess that raises the eyebrow back to Philly, where Doug loses his coordinator. That's the first of, all right, you're not in trouble right now, but one of these guys has got to go.
Yeah, it's scapegoating. That's what I called it. I talked about it a lot. It's the scapegoating process. That's how it starts with successful head coaches. Now, a lot of times, you just brought up Freddie Kitchens, you know, that just went bad. You're one and done. It was a bad decision. You move on. But with coaches with success, Mike Zimmer's had a lot of success in Minnesota, but people think they've underachieved. That's what you have. You have that first stage. Well, you got to change some of the assistants, or we're going to start looking at you. And then if it keeps going in a negative direction, then they start looking at the head coach. And the Eagles have started that process. The difference is the Eagles shouldn't have started that process, but they have.
It's hard for me, switching gears to Andrew Berry, or back to him, John, to wonder if this is I find this interesting by Cleveland. They had him in-house, so they absolutely, from that perspective, know who he is, and they clearly like his resume. It's a strange resume, though, because he was a scout for only about 5 or 6 years with the Colts first, and for the first year or two was very low level. So he really, compared to a guy like Joe Douglas, who had 20 years of scouting before he finally got to really be, a high level executive, he's kind of raw in that area. And here's the Browns, and you kind of wonder, is this the Browns kind of being the Browns again, trying to take reinvent the wheel, or is there something? Even from my own sources with the Eagles, it's always like, yeah, we know what he does and what he does, but it's like, what does he really do? Where is his voice heard the most for the Eagles, and how will that translate to Cleveland? I mean, you and I have talked about the fact that it's not going to be the biggest loss for the Eagles because they already have a lot of guys in prominent positions. But where do you think the Browns flourish in having Berry as their GM, or do you think they do?
Well, I don't think anybody. Andrew's sort of one of those guys who has a big reputation because of other things, and people. He's a Harvard graduate,
right?
And he does have personnel experience, and he does embrace analytics. So, I know from the Eagles' perspective, they're constantly trying to marry those two things, and they're constantly trying to get the personnel department on the same page as the analytics department. And I thought maybe he could be a bridge. I think that's how the rest of the league looks at him as well. He's a younger guy. They like that as well. He's got that innovative tag. I don't know if any of this is deserved because, let's be honest, Cleveland is not a great organization. And he was there under Sashi Brown, and it was interesting because he and Paul DePodesta, they sort of had a mini Chip Kelly, Howie Roseman thing there, because he and Paul DePodesta wanted to hire Kevin Stefanski last year, and John Dorsey wanted to elevate Freddie Kitchens,
right?
And Jimmy Haslam likes Paul DePodesta best. But he decided to give John Dorsey what he wanted. It didn't work, and he went backwards, sort of like what Jeffrey Lurie did here. And obviously DePodesta is still there. He was in charge of the search this time. Stefanski gets the job. And it's interesting. That's why people automatically said Andrew would be back in Cleveland. But Stefanski really pushed for George Payton, who most people thought there's no way Cleveland's going to get him because he turns down interviews from good organizations. But he did have that long-term relationship, 13 whatever years with Stefanski, so he obviously liked him. He was willing to take the interviews, but ultimately it came down to, like, this is Cleveland. I'm not going to this situation until they prove themselves that they can do things the right way. Pulls himself out, and Andrew's back in the mix. I think he'll get the job. I don't think, and I said it a lot, I don't think it's going to hurt the Eagles. And that's not an insult to Andrew Berry. It's just they kind of added him. He was sort of like Connor Barwin in the personnel department. You're not taking anyone else's job. You're just adding a position. Now, Andrew's position is much more high profile, much more important. Vice President of Football Operations had his tentacles in everything, but it was an added position. It wasn't taking away from Andy Watt. It wasn't taking away from Jake Rosenberg. It wasn't taking away from Alec Hallaby. So I don't think the Eagles are going to miss him all that much, but he might be a great general manager. I don't think anybody knows, but they like his background. Everybody in this league likes his background.
It's just weird because the Browns mess up so many things that as soon as you hear that the Browns like a guy, your first reaction is to be, oh boy, good luck.
Yeah, but you have to look at it, Jeff. The Eagles love him, and Carolina wanted to interview him for a vice president of football operations position, and the Eagles blocked that because it didn't come with personnel power, so they could block that one.
Right.
So there are other organizations that like him as well, and a lot of it comes down to just he's a Harvard guy, so people assume he's really smart, and he probably is. So that's kind of what it is.
John, before we roll here on a Football at 4, next week is the Super Bowl week lead-up. Does that preclude the Eagles, do you think, from doing anything? Like, does the NFL kind of say, like when the World Series is going on, we don't want you making any news? Do the Eagles fall out, or is next week still fair game?
I think it's still fair game. I do think there's some semblance of certainly some members of the organization will be down in South Florida, so that hurts things as well. But remember last year at the Super Bowl, they did the Carson Wentz interview, so they're not – sometimes the Eagles like to we're not on the front page. Let's get on the front page, at least locally. Who knows what they'll do, but I don't think either way, you're talking about position coaches, even the offensive coordinator. And I still think the timing and how this is going, it's pretty evident that the Eagles have their eye on somebody in that game. We all thought it to be Mike Kapp. It probably was. They're not going to get to interview him. Who knows with Mike LaFleur, Mike McDaniel on the other side. They got their eyes on somebody in that game.
Interesting. All right. Well, we'll all be watching the sidelines, the play calls, and all that stuff, not the game. That's the way we'll roll. Football at 4, Johnny Max in the house. And, of course, next week we will be taking a look at free agency, Super Bowl 54, the draft, and all that good stuff as the Sports Bash will be live on Radio Row in South Beach. John, thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, guys.
And John McMullen, like all guests of the show, he appeared via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.